You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
Hey everyone, welcome to CyberWire X, a series of specials where we highlight important security topics affecting security professionals worldwide. I'm Rick Howard, N2K's Chief Security Officer and the CyberWire's Chief Analyst and Senior Fellow. Today, Dave Bittner, the Senior Producer and host of many of the CyberWire's podcasts, will be joining me at the CyberWire's hash table to discuss post-infection remediation, or PIR. After the break, you'll first hear my conversation with Rick Doughton, the CISO for Healthcare Enterprises and Centene, and then Dave will talk with Trevor Hilligoss, the Director of Security Research at SpyCloud, the sponsor of this show. Come right back.
Never miss a thing with CyberWire Pro. Stay cyber aware by getting access to all our public podcasts ad-free, as well as our exclusive CyberWire Pro podcasts, briefing, articles, and events by becoming a CyberWire Pro subscriber. Get actionable reporting, analysis, and insights on global events occurring in the cybersecurity industry at your fingertips. Visit thecyberwire.com/pro to subscribe today.
Incident response has been around as a concept since the late 1980s, when it practically sprang out of whole cloth from Dr. Clifford Stoll, when he published his Communication of the ACM Journal article called Stalking the Wily Hacker in 1988, and his subsequent Cybersecurity Canon Hall of Fame book, The Cuckoo's Egg, Tracking the Spy Through the Maze of Computer Espionage in 1989. While tracking East German hacker mercenaries hired by the Russian government to break into U.S. academic systems in order to compromise U.S. government systems, because let's face it, back then, there really wasn't anything close to cybersecurity. The internet was mostly a collection of cans tied together by strings. Dr. Stoll invented incident response, and for the most part, the practice hasn't really changed much in terms of the big picture. To get some color on that, I reached out to Rick Doughton, an old friend of mine, a regular here at the CyberWire hash table, and fun fact, has been a judge multiple times at the American Pie Council's annual National Pie Championships. Who knew? But he's also the CISO for Healthcare Enterprises and Centene, a Fortune 500 company, and in his early days, he managed a commercial penetration and incident response team. So I started out asking him what it was like in those early days after Dr. Stoll invented the idea.
Yeah, I originally ran ethical hacking teams in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And then we realized that we needed to respond to incidents that our customers had. And so we put together one of the first forensics retainers on being able to do that. I mean, obviously we weren't the first, but our peers at 2000, 2001, all were doing the same thing. It's a niche thing. Not a lot of people do this. And even in the executive group, very few CISOs came up through the incident response. You and I have talked about over, the last decade, that, the defense industrial base, this intelligence response was a very common thing that was not in other industries outside of DC. And so, we had to educate folks in, 10, 13 years ago in other industries, including the financial industry, about, hey, don't just what happened, how did it happen, make it stop, and make sure it doesn't happen again. There's a whole bunch of little things in between that we want to learn from and do to, enrich that. In cybersecurity, I always say that a pen tester and an incident responder are two sides of the same coin. And so we found the pen testers made really good incident responders because they're digging through and looking for things to be able to say what happened, how did it happen.
That's a really interesting insight because as a pen tester, it's more offensive oriented. So you have that perspective. But if you're going to turn around to be an incident responder, you know how the offensive guys team did it. And so you're looking for things, right, on the defensive side that you can shore up. I had not really put that together. And you would think I would have done that by now.
Well, it's also the personality of being able to thrive in chaos, failing quickly, doing multiple things at once, these are things that both sides do really well, as opposed to like a pure play forensics person who is very single threaded, doing things very meticulously for maintaining chain of custody, or much slower in their process and don't want to fail because I got to get this image correct because I only have one shot at it. And so the forensics piece of the actual acquisition is very different, but into response is exactly as described. It's the opposite of pen testing.
Well, and there's all kinds of phases to incident response too, right? Besides just stopping the pain, okay, there are lots of things you have to do inside the company in terms of managing the crisis and deciding if it's serious and deciding if it's not, how far you need to escalate it up the company, doing a public announcement. And we're not even talking about all that. We're really just, in this discussion, we're just talking about the technical things that you need to get done. And I was really intrigued in something you said we were discussing this before we came on the air, Rick, that most small, medium-sized organizations don't have the resources to do a full-out incident response action plan. Most people just want to stop the pain and get them out.
Yeah, I say all the time is remember there's the Fortune 500 and 5 million other companies. So it's a 0.00001% have resources, money, and people, and most don't. When I was a virtual CISO for 5 years, the thing that I found most lacking in all my customers around the world is no incident response program. They had boxes that were lighting up when things happened. They had things that were supposed to detections. But if something happened, A, they weren't alerted, and B, they didn't know what to do because there was no plan and there were no people. So I think that's the thing that the most organizations don't have that. They just expect the technology to protect them and detect if something's wrong and tell them what to do about it, and not this whole formulaic thing that you described of there's communication, there's maybe legal involved, there's people involved, there's data protection and privacy things involved, there's business resiliency things involved, that it's not just a what happened and make it stop.
Or even for startup, small and medium-sized companies, stop the pain, yes, all that and more. But there might be some things you want to do after it's all over. And they're called post-infection remediation, which is a fancy name, or for things you need to do after the pain has stopped and you're trying to recover from all this. And one of them was remove the malware if possible. I wonder if you could talk about that, because that seems to be a problem, not even for smaller companies, but for, I don't know, even Fortune 500 companies. That malware seems to find its home somewhere that no one has located before.
Yeah, I mean, in the last 10 years, we've had much more persistent adversaries who want to maintain this persistence. And so it's not just here's a file that's known to be bad and your antivirus catches it and quarantines it, but it is a sometimes multi-stage process. There might be a PDF that is completely benign until you open it and it launches an executable, which then installs some registry entries to put some hooks in, opens up a listener for a command and control channel, and then goes and tries to mail itself or propagate itself across the domain to other systems. And so when you find that this one patient is infected and you say, oh, okay, I delete this, badware.exe, but I didn't delete the PDF from which it was spawned, and I didn't know it, and it entered 4 registry entries, and I didn't know it opened a port as a listener, and I didn't know that it also tried to propagate itself. So that's why I think it's prudent to say, if possible. That's one of the things that before EDR was an EDR, there was, I guess Carbon Black still exists, but the very first iteration of Carbon Black, I used to love that because it would give me this whole life cycle of this is the PDF, this is what was launched, this was created, this is the things, and I can use that as a recipe to take all of that out at one time and then search across all my other devices to is this registry entry anywhere else? Is this listener, this port open that shouldn't be anywhere else? Is this executable or PDF open anywhere else?
The example I always go to for these kinds of discussions is the OPM breach from a number of years ago. All right. The IT staff didn't even notice that the Chinese were in their networks for a year. But when they finally noticed, they assumed they were in that one spot where they noticed the effort, right? They didn't understand that it was rampant through their organization. And then when they finally brought in a third-party contractor who did the analysis and found it all and got rid of almost everything, they missed one version of it that ran on a remote Linux box, and so it was still inside their network. So, what's the advice that you give to these kind of small, medium companies who don't have the resources to track that kind of thing down?
Right. You have to hire help. I mean, unless you have a good person. Now, you also have the advantage that it's a small footprint. 99.9% of organizations in the US, as you kind of point out, are less than 500 people. They're small footprints. They're also today mostly work from home. So you're not on this broadcast domain that it's easier to traverse because everyone's somewhere else, particularly in these smaller companies that are completely cloud native. But that's a very common thing to miss, that in that description I just said, that, and one of those actions was, who are the domain admins, and let me go to domain controller, let me pass the hash and get the admin password, create my own backdoor, my own domain admin on the domain that nobody even noticed, and maintain persistence that way. So I clean up everything, but they already have a backdoor because they have a domain account sitting there. So very, very common. So all of the incident responders are kind of trained now to be very, very comprehensive. But back to your question, what do small companies do? You hire people who do this for a living. That's one of the advice I've given people before was, a virtual CISO is kind of like having outside counsel. A small company can't have, pay for an inside general counsel, so they have them outside. And it's the same kind of thing with security.
Well, I mean, there's a whole list of things you probably could do, but I agree with you, Rick, that especially if you're a small to medium-sized company, maybe you might purchase insurance so that you can pay for this kind of thing when it happens. Maybe that's the way you do it, or just bite the bullet when it does happen, just to make sure that you can be safe going forward. You did this for a long time. What was the go-to move after you guys remediated the initial problem? What did you tell your clients to do most of the time?
Well, learn from this, because usually when we went in and fixed something, we found a whole bunch of other things like, this happened because this wasn't turned on, or you realize you have a different version of XYZ across all this, and you don't have this on all these devices. So it's the learning what to do to improve it to make sure it doesn't happen again in the short term. Is, here's all this stuff as an opportunity because we just had this event. You now have the attention to maybe get some money to fix the things that you've probably been asking for forever, but now it's been realized.
Well, good stuff, Rick. Thanks for coming on and explaining this. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much for having me.
Next up is Dave Bittner's conversation with Trevor Hilligoss, the Director of Security Research at SpyCloud, our show's sponsor.
So today we are talking about Infostealers. Can you give us a little bit of the background and, the lay of the land and history of what brought us to where we are today when it comes to Infostealers?
Oh boy, how much time do you have? There's been a lot. Yeah. So Infostealers as a type of malware are not new. They've been around for, I think we're coming on a decade-ish. Depends on, what you count as, I guess, patient zero. Infostealers, I like to joke, folks in security, we're I guess I'll speak for myself, unimaginative in our naming conventions. So, Infostealers are pretty descriptive. But we're basically talking about a type of malware whose entire purpose of existing is to steal information from an infected host, right? So generally speaking, and this has changed depending on when you look at it in time, generally speaking, non-persistent malware. So, stealthy, delivered to a host, executed, performs its, stealing functions, which vary from malware to malware, and then exfiltrates that data off to a place that the attacker can access it and use it for a variety of purposes. Typically, we're talking fraud, some kind of monetization, but really it runs the gambit. Everything from ransomware to, espionage type stuff to just good old data theft, post on carding sites. So yeah, it's a broad spectrum of nasty stuff.
Can we go through the Infostealer life cycle? I mean, how does one typically find oneself falling victim to this, and what's the process by which it does its business?
Generally speaking, if we're talking about attack vectors, what we see, and just to kind of clarify, when I talk about, observation, stuff like that, my insight into this comes mainly from the post exfiltration. So we're looking at the data that's actually stolen by these info stealers, not necessarily looking at, doing reverse engineering of any binaries. Although we have done that. I often find that it's more interesting, or it can be more interesting, to look at the proceeds of this type of malware, especially for questions about, what the intent is. But the general attack delivery, at least the most successful, tends to be some kind of, ruse. So we've seen everything from using some kind of like AdSense. Maybe they're going to post like an ad on Google describing something as a popular messaging app, say like Signal or Telegram, or you pick your app. And that directs you to a website that's carefully crafted to look like or be believable enough to be the real thing. But in fact, what you get is Redline or Raccoon or another info stealer. That tends to be common. It also tends to be fairly short-lived, right? Google's pretty good at catching those things. But if you think about it, the amount of eyeballs on the internet these days, it doesn't, an ad doesn't have to be live for too long for it to get quite a few clicks. Similarly, we also see, and this is, I guess, kind of a recent change, at least the past couple of years, we've seen this spike up. But using things like compromised YouTube channels. So, hackers will essentially take over someone's popular YouTube channel and then use that and its built-in fan base to spread an info stealer quite broadly. But one of the biggest, links between all of these, quite honestly, is the use of social media and, socially relevant things. So games, cracked software, all of that stuff tends to be, kind of the dealer's choice of these malware operators that are running these schemes.
And how do you assess the technical sophistication of these packages? Are we talking about sophisticated things, or is this the entry level for folks who are out there developing malware?
So that's actually a really good question, Dave. One of the really interesting things about info stealers is a lot of these operate as what we call malware as a service. So how I like to describe this is, we're all kind of familiar with sort of like managed software, right? So think about like, Adobe Photoshop. You subscribe to a monthly subscription, maybe it's a yearly subscription. It gets you access to the software. You get support that comes with it. So if something goes wrong, you can contact Adobe. They'll help you out. There's other things that are sort of packaged up in that one subscription deal. The analogy is basically the same for info stealers, malware as a service info stealers. These criminals, developers will create this malware. They will, publish it on criminal forums online, and then market that to other criminals who typically pay either weekly or monthly subscription fees, and those can range anywhere from $50 up to $200. I think the highest I've seen was like $250, paid in crypto, obviously. But then that allows that user who might not be very sophisticated, maybe they couldn't have created that malware on their own, but because they were able to pay that money to the person that did create it, now they're able to have this malware that they can deploy, and then they can reap the proceeds from it. So it's almost like a distributed method of criminality. It doesn't. When we talk about sophistication, typically we're talking about like nation state actors, and those are like the very sophisticated. But what's kind of crazy about the info stealers and the malware as a service model is it almost democratizes the sophistication, right? You don't necessarily need to be some kind of like elite hacker with all of these coding experience to be able to do a lot of damage, because you can take something that was built by somebody else who does have those, that experience and those skills, and then craft your own relatively low sophistication ruse and still be able to victimize, a massive amount of people.
Help me understand what the specific concern here is for the corporate cybersecurity professional. I mean, are info stealers targeting individuals, and the corporation gets infiltrated as a side effect, or are they targeting companies as well?
Yeah. So I don't know who said this quote originally, so I'm probably going to steal it from somebody. But there's this mechanics quote. It goes something like, 90% of the problems in a car are between the driver's seat and the steering wheel, right? I think you could apply that very easily to IT in terms of like, do these info stealers target companies? I'm not going to say no. I'm sure there are criminals out there that are definitely targeting specific companies, but oftentimes it really seems like more of a spray and pray methodology, right? We're going to infect the maximum number of victims that we possibly can. And then in sorting through, the proceeds of those infections, we'll find a gem. And that gem might be, if you're an initial access broker, maybe it's, some Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 company that you're going to be able to sell that access to a ransomware affiliate that can then, infect that company or exfiltrate data and charge a ransom. It could be, on the lower level, somebody that's interested in carding or identity theft, right? All they're looking for is things that they can sell to other criminals or even use themselves. It could be even more simple than that. So the real big danger really in all of that is corporations are made up of individuals, right? So even if something isn't necessarily targeting you as a corporation by name, your employees being human beings and being online people are still part of that targeting pool. So if you have a situation where you have maybe unmanaged or undermanaged, or you have like bring your own device policies, basically anything that, allows access to your environment that's not necessarily tightly controlled or monitored, you're kind of increasing your vulnerabilities to this kind of malware, because those employees that are doing things maybe on their personal device could leak information that does connect back to your corporate infrastructure, and then in turn could turn into a significant event.
What are your recommendations then? I mean, for folks to best protect themselves against this, what sort of things should they be focused on?
Yeah, so we just released a report that in part surveys a bunch of security professionals asking a lot of questions about how they see infostealers, whether they're worried about them, what their security controls consist of. Alongside that, my research team did some our own research on the data, and we looked at what do we see in these logs, and kind of what context can we provide to the greater survey. And one of the things that was really interesting from that was we found greater than 1/5 of all of the Infostealer logs. So these are logs, folders. You can think of them like folders containing a bunch of files that were stolen from a device. 1/5, so 20% of those logs had an installed antivirus appliance at the time of execution. So the easy thing would be to say, make sure your security controls are very good. Make sure you have good antivirus. Make sure it's well updated. Make sure you have visibility of your networks. You decrease bring your own device policies. You monitor things like MFA, and you have good, cookie revocation policies. All of those things that are great policies in general. None of that is infallible, right? And I'm not saying don't do that stuff. Like, definitely
right.
Do all of that, please.
Yeah.
But as a security practitioner, it's really good to do all of those things and still have a backup plan. And I would say that backup plan really is visibility, and it's visibility beyond what we traditionally consider part of the sort of digital forensics incident response process. So we're hyper-focused on devices. We're really focused on networks and things like firewall logs and application logs and all these kinds of things. But with Infostealers especially, we have this sort of wildcard variable at play that is everything that was taken from that device that we might not have a record of. If you ask me like, hey, give me a list of all of the accounts that you have, I mean, I could probably construct like an 80% list, but I don't know all the accounts that I have, right?
Right.
Maybe that's just me. Maybe somebody else has a much better awareness of their online.
I don't think it's just you.
It's hard.
I think we all suffer from that. All those legacy accounts that just I sometimes call them zombie accounts, because they just hang around and they refuse to die.
That's good. Zombie. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Right. We're so deeply invested in the internet that, our online identity really has become our identity. IRL has become just RL.
Right.
And I think, that kind of situation, it becomes very difficult. So, having that understanding, approaching an incident with, I'm going to look at this device. Obviously, I'm going to do a good incident response, forensic centric incident response, but also what else could have been stolen? What types of, session tokens could have been stolen? What are the validity periods of those? What kind of, maybe there's API tokens if we're talking about like a developer or somebody that has access to that kind of, internal systems. What other information could be on their intellectual property? A lot of stealers will actually steal files, full fat files from a desktop or documents folder. So what was in those files? Is that intellectual property? Is it something that might be export controlled, right? There's all these other questions that we start asking And just having the knowledge and the foresight to ask those questions, I think, is really half the battle.
I know you and your colleagues there at SpyCloud, you have this notion of post-infection remediation. I mean, is that really what we're getting at here?
Yeah, basically. So, post-infection remediation, again, with the names, we're pretty simple people. I think it's pretty descriptive. Got to break it down for people like me that used to work for the government. But it's basically that. Do all the great instant response things that, we've all learned from SANS or whoever else. We've gone to all these classes and learned these things. Do those, but also, consider outside of the device, especially as we start, or not even start, right? This is well on its way. Like we're very cloud focused now. We've got all these different appliances, with third-party appliances, security appliances that are out there, SSOs. Our environment is no longer just a computer or even just a network, right? It's our corporate environment is much larger now. So consider those things and understand things like, if I have a cookie, an authentication cookie, and it's valid, and I also have some basic device information like your screen size and your OS type, some of that stuff, I can become you, right? It's not hard. There's open source tools out there that allow me to essentially emulate your device and pass that cookie as if I was just hitting F12 and refreshing the page. And so in that kind of a situation, you can have the best multi-factor authentication in the world. If I can do that, and maybe I can exit from, I get a residential proxy and one of your neighbors down the street, or even you specifically, right, your own router, I can look basically identical. And so it's very difficult to control for that. So PIR is basically, let's summarize all of that, bring ourselves, expand your consciousness. It's like that, big brain meme, right? Expand your consciousness beyond just this device and think about all the other pieces of information that we create either intentionally or unintentionally and are still out there in the environment that we need to control for.
As you're out and about, working with folks on this problem, to what degree are they self-aware? I mean, are people accurate and up to date on the reality of their vulnerability to this? Or are people whistling past the graveyard?
I like that, whistling past the graveyard. I think it's security. I'll speak for myself. I have a tendency to be overly pessimistic. We have an amazing amount of experience and knowledge, and there is a lot of awareness. Now, is that enough? I don't know the answer to that question necessarily. I think going back to the survey that we did, we had a lot of respondents say that they were concerned about this and that they're at least cognizant. I think one of the statistics was like 98%, I want to say, they would want better visibility into at-risk appliances. So that tells me that people are at least aware of what they don't know, knowledgeable that they need to close that gap as much as possible. But when you get into the specifics, especially about Infostealer malware, because it is very niche, right? This is something that not everybody has dedicated their life to this like I have. I don't recommend that. In fact, you should have a hobby. But, something that, specific, that is much more niche. And so that's why I see like what I like doing is what you're offering me today, a platform to come on and talk about this, because I'm not saying, you're going to listen to this podcast and become an expert on Infostealers. But hopefully some of the things that I've said have hit a nerve. And maybe if you were part of that 98% that said, yeah, we want to know more, maybe one of these things that I said has kind of keyed into that and given you a question to ask or a bit of information to go after. So that's kind of what I would say in terms of like general knowledge and how do we spread the message. I think it's just kind of being repetitive and saying the same things and highlighting what I see and some of my peers see as significant vulnerabilities and things that are precursors, things like ransomware, and then raising the visibility kind of writ large.
We'd like to thank Rick Doughton, the CISO for Healthcare Enterprises and Centene, and Trevor Hilligoss, the Director of Security Research at SpyCloud, for helping us get our arms around the idea of post-infection remediation. And we'd like to thank SpyCloud for sponsoring the show. This has been a production of the CyberWire and In2K, and we feel privileged that podcasts like CyberWire X are part of the daily intelligence routine of many of the most influential leaders and operators in the public and private sector, as well as the critical security teams supporting the Fortune 500 and many of the world's preeminent intelligence and law enforcement agencies. N2K Strategic Workforce Intelligence optimizes the value of your biggest investment, people. We make you smarter about your team while making your team smarter. Learn more at n2k.com. Our senior producer is Jennifer Iben. Our sound engineer is Trey Hester. And on behalf of my colleague Dave Bittner, this is Rick Howard signing off. Thanks for listening.